Yeah, thank you to everyone who's joining the webinar. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer so that those who are waiting to be admitted are all admitted, and then we will get the show on the road. See, the numbers are ticking up still, so I'll give it a little bit longer, maybe for a minute, and then we'll get started. We've got a healthy crowd coming in. One more, and we've hit 100. Come on. Someone, yes, we're there. Okay, let me get started then. Welcome everybody to today's discussion on the implications of the recent elections in Taiwan. My name is Tony Saich. I'm the director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia here at the Ash Center. I'm going to start with a few formal announcements before we get started with the actual discussion. First is that the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and the Nipmuc nations. I'd also like to thank, we would like to thank our co-sponsor for today's event, which is the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here at Harvard University. People should note that today's discussion is being recorded. You'll receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event. You'll also be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. In terms of the structure, we'll keep the last 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. And you can submit those questions at any time that you would like in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Today's event is part of the Global Elections webinar series, which is sponsored by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and the Rajawali Institute. In fact, we have almost half of the world's population heading to the polls in 2024. So throughout the semester, we will schedule with other Harvard scholars examinations of a number of those elections and electoral trends from across the globe. So we hope you'll be able to join us for future events throughout the year. So I'm very lucky to have two guests joining me today, both of whom are well informed about the dynamics of the processes of the elections and general developments within Taiwan. Oh, someone's telling me my voice is too loud. Is that better? Who knows? Anyway, first of all, Eric Huang is with us. He's currently a Mason Fellow here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's pursuing a master's in public administration. Previously, he served as a spokesperson for the KMT, and then as the deputy director of the International Affairs Department. He was also appointed as KMT deputy representative of the United States and has served as an adjunct lecturer at Taiwan's Tamkang University. And we're very lucky, as I said before, to have him with us in the Mason program through this academic year. Wenchi Yu, our other participant, is a global affairs advisor and business operator, specializing in a range of things, including cross-border market access strategies between Asia and the United States. She is also, I must say, an international affairs commentator, very influentially so, for TVBS News, which is a Taipei headquartered media outlet, mostly with Chinese language viewers globally. She has a whole range of attributes, including advice and to many global technology companies, advising on public policy, social impact, public relations, and also with Goldman Sachs. Currently, she is also a non-resident fellow with us here at the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia. So let me first set a little bit the scene, so as everybody knows where we are with this. I want to make two initial points. The first is that much of the discussion within the United States of America has focused on the cross-straits consequences, Beijing's response, and what it means for the United States of America. Far less attention is being paid to what we want to concentrate on today. What does this actually mean for the people of Taiwan? Secondly, in as far as that has been covered, much of the coverage really has focused more on the presidential election. And we've seen a number of stereotypes being put forward that are quite incorrect. For example, I was watching CNN where the commentator consistently talked about the Nationalist Party, the KMT, as being the pro-Beijing party, and others have referred to the DPP as supporting independence. Both of those, of course, are nonsense, but it perpetuates a myth throughout the United States. So what interests us today as the Ash Center is a focus on democracy in Taiwan and the domestic dynamics of the election. As I said, first, for those of you tuning in, let me just rehearse the basic numbers. In the presidential elections, the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, got 40% of the vote, down from the last two elections when President Tsai Ing-wen got about 56% of the vote. The KMT got 33.5%, which is actually less than it got in 2020. And the new player on the stage was the Taiwan People's Party with 26.5% of the vote, which is more third-party votes than any other third-party candidate since the year 2000. If we turn to the legislative elections, it's the first time since 2004 that no party has an outright majority, which will make for interesting politics moving forward. The KMT had a gain of 14 seats to take 52. The DPP lost seats and has 51. And the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, has 8 seats. So there are also 2 non-party members in the legislature. And in the past, they have tended towards the KMT in terms of their support and voting patterns. So it all makes for very interesting politics moving forward. And let me now turn to our 2 discussants. And let me start off with an obvious question. And I'll start with Wenchi. Let me ask you, what is the most striking feature in your perspective about those elections?
Well, thank you, Tony. It's good to be here to talk about Taiwan beyond the news headlines. I would say, from my point of view, there are a few really interesting, striking features. The first one was actually the drama in the opposition. So for those of you who actually pay a lot of attention to the drama leading up to the actual elections, the talk had been very much focused on whether the opposition would coalesce around just one team, because there was no chance for them to win over the DPP if they maintain sort of split in different teams. And so what was most striking was the failure of the opposition coalition. So the KMT and the Taiwan People's Party, TPP, and Terry Gou, who was the founder of Foxconn, pretty much had been in conversation and talking to each other, negotiating whether they would come together as a team or not. Terry Gou is an especially interesting figure for those of you who probably have heard of him from his business career. He was the founder of Foxconn, and who basically ran as an independent. And he first registered to run in the KMT's primary, but then when Ho Yo-yi was selected, he decided to run as an independent and actually collected petitions to reach the 900,000 threshold, basically signatures from the people for registration, but then did not really register in the end and decided to drop out of the election just a few days before the presidential election registration deadline. And what was really interesting was, according to the polls, even months before the election and getting close to the election, DPP had always had a lead that neither KMT nor the TPP alone could catch up easily. So the only winning opportunity for the opposition was really to form a coalition. However, this drama-filled process dragged out for months and ultimately led to a very bitter bartering before the press which led to the complete collapse of the coalition just before the presidential election registration deadline. So by then, I think most people had anticipated a DPP win. Then, most of the media, at least domestic media, has shifted to the legislative elections. And so it became more of a fight to secure a DPP majority in the legislative yuan, or for the KMT to try to regain control of the legislative yuan. And I would say then the second striking feature was the international factor. Most people in the US probably would find it difficult to understand why voters may care about international views of their candidates. But in Taiwan, because of its unique status, Taiwanese society as a whole is extremely sensitive to international press coverage, and how the US and China in particular viewed their candidates. So what we saw was that, months before, again, the election, all candidates vying for the presidency had to pay a visit to the US at some point. And the press would then base their reception in the US, including what individuals and what levels of government officials each candidate could meet, to make assumption of who the US actually supports. And of course, the US has no official sort of position on any of the candidates. And what's interesting was also this time around, the vice president selection, the vice presidential candidate selection, also reflected the need for each team to have the international experience and almost like a recognition. So for example, the DPP's Kim Hsia was Taiwan's de facto ambassador to DC, and she became really popular during her time in DC. And certainly she was recruited because of her popularity and did add value to the DPP's Lai Ching-te, and may even mitigate some suspicion of Lai's trustworthiness on cross-strait relations, because there is a lot of suspicion around Lai based on his past remarks related to Taiwan independence. And TPP's vice presidential candidate, Cynthia Wu, who came from this really big family, almost like a tycoon background, also had extensive international experience. In fact, she was educated in the US, and I would say her English was probably better than her Chinese. So you could kind of see why they pick certain vice presidents and what they're trying to convey to the voters. And then the last one, sorry to go long, is the striking feature was sort of the very careful messaging domestically and internationally, right? As Tony said, there was a lot of press coverage, and it was unprecedented international coverage, but it was mostly centered on sort of this Taiwan versus China cross-strait relations, consequences of this election, primarily because of the DPP's presidential candidate Lai was portrayed and viewed by Beijing unfavorably for his past remarks, and potential leaning towards so-called Taiwan independence. So many stories were really about what Beijing might do with Lai's victory. Some even went far as to speculate a crisis similar to Nancy Pelosi's visit. And so the KMT kind of leveraged that and, turned this election, sort of frame it as a choice between war and peace, indicating that there would be a war if the DPP won the third term. And given the framing, what's interesting was about DPP's messaging, especially I would say its messaging domestically. It really it didn't respond to any of that war and peace related conversations. Instead, it was more about sort of safeguarding Taiwan's democracy. So it was framed as a choice between democracy and autocracy. And of course, it was an implicit indication that, if the KMT won, which was viewed as more friendly to Beijing, then, Beijing would co-opt the KMT to sacrifice Taiwan's democracy. That was sort of how I view sort of the messaging, right? However, I would say I'm not sure how much people really buy into this kind of contradiction, whether it's democracy versus autocracy or war and peace. I don't really believe that Taiwanese people really believe it's that drastically different. And so in the end, I think the DPP won because also it, projected itself as more of a stable and, capable hands, right? So one of the commercial that went really viral online was the one with President Tsai driving a car with Vice President Lai in the passenger seat, then changing hands to Vice President Lai driving with Big Kim Xiao in the passenger seat. And the entire commercial was very calm, signaling stability, steady hands, driving on the democracy road into Taiwan's future. So that stability and sort of this calmness, sort of feeling that the DPP is giving to people, I think, may have resonated quite well with the voters
Great.
this time around.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so we had the clash of egos, which meant that the opposition potential fell apart. And actually, the opinion polls after that were pretty accurate in terms of what the final results were. So Beijing, in that sense, had plenty of opportunity to know what the outcome was going to be. You said that the DPP win, but the DPP didn't really win. I mean, it was a minority vote for the presidency, and it didn't win in the legislature. But before we get into that in a bit more depth, Eric, what was the most striking feature to you about the elections?
Well, thank you, Tony. It's a real honor to be here. And I think we should all congratulate Taiwan on this democratic victory. And I also like to stress that my views shared here are of my own. I'm off the party duty, even though I'm the party spokesperson. And I relate a lot of things Wenchi say. One aspect I would like to talk about is the opposition between the KMT and Taiwan's People's Party were both expecting some type of bandwagon effect, meaning that in the past, when you have elections like this, we don't have to look back that far. 2012, we had a third-party candidate, James Song, in a three-way race, and he made very little impact. And Ma Ying-jeou, then former president, was reelected, and this effect didn't happen. And according to my account, I think this didn't happen precisely because the KMT narrative never clicked with people. Were people really bought into this election being between war and peace? I think KMT would have captured some of the votes that they were hoping for. But if you look at the numbers, which is really interesting, in this election, there are about 600,000 more people voted than the last election. And there is a difference between 2.7 million votes that President Tsai received in 2020 versus 5.5 million votes in William Lai, the president-elect. And if you look at the KMT, we drop about 500,000 votes. So a lot of those votes went to Ke Wen-je. So post the election, a lot of commentators are talking about maybe those votes would have gone to William Lai anyway. So I think in general, I agree that opposition would have been stronger with just one candidate. But if you kind of narrow down, look from the KMT perspective, the three-way race might not be the worst thing for us. And this election has largely been on domestic issues. So Hou You-yi came right off the bat offering the younger Taiwanese housing opportunities. And I think William Lai's first policy, as far as I remember, is waiving student loans, right? And Ke Wen-je somehow managed to be the most popular among Taiwanese younger voters. And that can speak to you how frustrated a lot of younger Taiwanese people are with these two big parties, be it both KMT and the DPP, right? That being said, Cross-strait relations was never really a big factor until maybe the last week of the election. And if you recall, two big things has happened. One was the Chinese, they shot some satellite over Taiwan, and there was some controversy in Taiwan in terms of the translation. I think the Ministry of Defense mistakenly called satellite as missiles. I think that's one thing. The second thing is President Ma's interview, where his quotation was taken out of context, and he was quoted saying he trusted Xi Jinping. But if you just go back, I'm not here to defend him, but if you look back on what he said, that's not exactly what he said, right? So in this election, what is also interesting is that KMT, DPP, and the TPP, there's almost no losers in here. It's almost everybody are winners in the party perspective. William Lai, who stresses on continuity, which means he will follow the footsteps of President Tsai. And people might even argue he has chosen his VP as a political successor of Tsai Ing-wen in Biking Xiao, who is a really well-respected person in national security realm, where I made my career in US-Taiwan policy. And KMT, even though we lost the presidency, we are now the biggest party within the legislature. We have gained 15 seats. And not only that, within this 15 seats, 7 of those are people under age of 40, and all of them are first-time elected politicians. And if you look at TPP, you have to say they have done much better than they ever expected in terms of how many legislators they have gained. So you can call this a win all across the board. And people can even make the case that Beijing has somehow came out with this in a better shape, because cross-strait relations wasn't a main point, a main discussion in this election. And one can even argue that, yes, Taiwanese people, we value our autonomy, we believe in democracy, and we are willing to sacrifice for our way of life, but we are a country who wants to be friendly with China, our neighbor, whether it's because of business, culture, or just being the location, right? So all three parties this time are very reasonable in terms of cross-strait relations. What has changed is one can argue in 2016 when we had our presidential candidate Hong Shou-ju, maybe the US wasn't very enthusiastic, right? This time, I believe most candidates came to the US, they all got quite positive feedbacks. And one of our colleagues, Carl Templeman from Stanford, even went as far as saying that he has heard some people within the US government believe this time KMT could be a good choice if he elected president for cross-strait relations. I don't know who he heard it from. I'm not surprised if he heard that from somebody, senior officials in the party. Last point I would make here is that if you simply look at why the KMT could obtain more votes for party in terms of legislators than the president, suggests to you that KMT has a very strong base within the Taiwan, even until today. Infrastructures is what we call as a campaign manager. So KMT's base was quite unified, and it has been the most unified in the past 4 election cycles. So I think from within, people will say, oh, this is the time when KMT really have to reflect upon your ideology and going forward, because you cannot use the excuse of the party wasn't unified to explain why we lost this time. And I think Taiwanese people have spoken: economy, stable cross-strait relations, good relationship with the US and other democratic allies, and whomever can deliver that the best will be the person that Taiwanese people see as most fit to be the president. So even though William Lai has a weak mandate, as Professor Saich pointed out, but I feel like even that mandate means something. If people really felt that William Lai will be a danger to Taiwan's future, that he will bring an imminent war, I believe the supporters of opposition would have bandwagon. In this case, they didn't, because they think all three candidates can manage cross-strait relations in a way that we won't have to face imminent military conflict.
Great, thanks very much. There's a few things I'd like to drill down on a little bit further. Certainly young people being frustrated with the two major parties is something not unfamiliar to those of us in the United States. But let me carry on first with Eric, and then I want to come back to Wenchi. And this really relates to what you're talking about in terms of the strength of the KMT, that it has that very solid organizational capacity and local base. Because we did see in rounds of local elections that it actually has done very well. And as you said, it also did very well in the legislature by comparison. But for the third time, it failed to win the presidency. So what explains this? I mean, you touched on it, I think, but is it that when it comes to the question of the presidency, then the issue of the mainland becomes more prevalent, maybe becomes more of a national security question? And is there then a lingering perception from some that it might be considered as too friendly towards China?
Right. So well, I think that's a great question. I'll answer it externally and internally in both ways. So internally, if you look at a KMT, right? So there are basically three types of politicians within the KMT. There are people come from political families. If you look into the South or even Central Taiwan, KMT has a lot of legacy candidates, we call it, people from political families. That's one type of. The second type are just influencers joining the party. The third type are just people rising up from the file and ranks. And both three type of candidates, if you look at this election, we have the highest number for people, just staffers, and coming to become politicians for the first time. So I think that's a really good sign for the party. And if you compare this election to the local election where KMT had a resounding victory just 2 years ago, I think the difference is now, then, a lot of Taiwanese people were really frustrated with the DPP at the time. This is what we call just baggage for current administration. Especially, we went through 3 years of COVID. Imagine how frustrated people must be. Just locking at home. Let's not get into the weeds, but people in Taiwan was frustrated. They had to wait to get their vaccination. We have to put on masks everywhere we go. So I think that was understandable. And in this election, COVID wasn't much of an issue. People really want to know who has the vision for the future. I think that's why I wanted to congratulate Taiwan for our democracy, right? Quite frankly, when we talk about war and peace, I understand there is a political risk, but I've been hearing this argument for the past 20 years, as far as I remember. Almost every time there's a presidential election, it's always, oh, Republic of China will cease to exist. Oh, the Chinese will come over. We have heard that since 1996 when Li Denghui was the elected president. That's my math up, right? That's almost 30 years ago, no? So I think Taiwanese people are used to it. When I was in Washington dealing with a lot of policymakers, the one question I can never really answer is, why are Taiwanese people so calm? And if you look at the numbers of PLA fighter jets coming over, or their cruise ships circling Taiwan, Taiwanese people are used to this. Taiwanese people are pragmatic. I think that's one of the attributes to the DPP under President Tsai is they are no longer just a pro-independence party. They come to the middle. They are middle left, versus KMT in this election, we are a middle right party. So even though we lost the presidency, from an internal perspective, I think the party has reformed. I think we're in pretty good shape. Externally, if you're looking at Taiwan in the larger aspect, all three parties are aligned somewhat in terms of cross-strait relations. All three parties has aligned somewhat in terms of this relationship with the United States. Lastly, I will say this. I think going forward, I think that domestic issues will be the number one in the legislature. I know the KMT has already prepared a lot of issues, health related, technology related, environment related. So when will we hear more about US-Taiwan or cross-strait relations? I think that heavily relies on who will be the next US president. Otherwise, I think Taiwan will focus on domestic issues.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, certainly I was in Taipei in December, and most of the discussion about the election really was focused around domestic issues. And certainly Washington seemed more hyped up about the idea of conflict and the stress in cross-straits relations than many colleagues in Taiwan did. And as you said, I often heard that phrase, look, we've been living with this 30, 40 years. We don't dismiss it, but it's integrated in a different way. But I want to drill down a little bit further on one of the other issues and maybe come to you, Wenchi, and that is about this surprise, in a sense, to people outside of the success of the Taiwan People's Party, 26.5% for the presidency. Because of the way the electoral system works in Taiwan, it only finished up with 8 seats. But I think can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what explained the rise? Why was it so popular with younger people? And I suppose the bottom line question is it just a protest party or will it have staying power?
Well, first of all, I think just so people understand sort of the numbers, right, each party received because of the way Taiwan's legislative yuan's electoral system is set up. So people are not just electing legislatures directly. These are sort of in the single member district. They also elect parties. And so when they vote for, parties that are registered on the ticket, and each party basically, will get certain allocation of seats based on how many votes they receive. So in that case, the DPP actually received 36% of the party votes. So just as a reference, President-elect Ching-te received 40% of the votes, right? And then the KMT received 34%. And the TPP received 22%, which was definitely significant for a relatively new party. So what is the TPP? It was founded in 2019 by then Taipei Mayor Ko Wen-je. Now, Ko Wen-je was Taipei City Mayor from 2014 to 2022. And Ko's rise really sort of captured the moment and the sentiment in Taiwan at that time, which was fatigue with both DPP and KMT. Both were viewed as establishment. And when Ko Wen-je ran in 2014, the DPP actually threw their support behind Ko Wen-je because Ko at that time was viewed as more pro the DPP because he had been a longtime supporter of former President Chen Shui-bian, etc. And in 2018, when he ran for the re-election, his popularity has declined quite a bit, but he was still re-elected with a very narrow win. And his popularity among young voters has never really diminished, especially because of the way he communicates. He's viewed as a straight talker. He says what he thinks. He's not aligned with any other party. And so, in terms of his policy, it's, to be honest, like from my point of view, it's rather inconsistent. It's harder to tell what, he really stands for. And so there's kind of a joke that most of his supporters are those who, haven't grown up. But his popularity, again, among the young voters, especially among, according to a poll, the teenagers who weren't eligible to vote this time, but will be eligible to vote, was extremely high. And so from this past election, right, what we saw was like support for both established parties kind of subsided. And so this indicated an opportunity for the TPP for the first time, actually 8 seats in Legislative Yuan versus 53 KMT, 52 DPP. It's a really significant force. So TPP support, I would say, almost will become crucial in any legislative vote. Now, whether the TPP has staying power really depends on the organization and Ko-Wen-je's leadership. So the last few days, if you pay attention to Taiwan's media, TPP is going through a lot of internal infighting. And TPP has always been viewed as a one-man party, which is Ko-Wen-je's party. And so his deputies, some of them are going to be in the Legislative Yuan. So, there's a lot of sort of speculation, who's going to have more power, etc. And so many would describe the organization right now as rather chaotic. And what's interesting is Ko-Wen-je's role, right? Traditionally as sort of the most prominent leader of the party, but right now he's not going to have a platform because he's no longer in the government. He's also not going to be in the Legislative Yuan, where most of the media attention will be. So how he's going to be the party's leader versus his deputies, how he's going to stay relevant will all be questions.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because obviously both DPP and KMT have been able to hone their organization over a longer period of time. First when DPP was pre-DPP as the Dangwai sort of movement and its sort of strengths in the South, and then KMT with its traditional infrastructure and also the legacies that Eric talked about earlier. I do in a moment want to give people a chance to raise some questions. But there's a couple of, and I do have a number of questions myself, but let me just first limit to one, Eric, to you. And this is about energy policy on Taiwan and the question of energy sufficiency rather, and sustainability. Now, the DPP has nailed its colors pretty conclusively to a no nuclear policy, which initially sort of has proved popular also with younger people, but doesn't seem to me to be able to resolve China's long-term energy demands. It's going to be very difficult to make the shift to renewables that's talked about. Given that the KMT may have a majority in the legislature, does it offer any alternative looking at this particular question of energy policy?
Well, I think a lot of observers will describe nuclear policy for DPP as a religion. This is not something they're willing to compromise. This is not something they're willing to have discussions with the opposition. I would say that they have quite successfully dominated narrative in Taiwan for the past 10 years or so. However, technology is progressing and technology are changing people's minds. If you look at the KMT, which has historically been a very pro-business party, who has been the party responsible for Taiwan's economic miracles. So when the KMT look at this issue, even though environmental perspective is very important, KMT also comes in from a business perspective. And this is where it differs with the DPP. Right? DPP is a party that has lofty goals and lofty objectives, which you can argue is quite admirable, that what they try to achieve. They want to do zero CO2 emission by year 2035, if I believe correctly. A lot of people believe that is not realistic to achieve. But KMT has shifted its policy and position somewhat in the past 3 years, especially, when a lot of people now consider the advanced nuclear technology can be green, right? We're no longer talking about those huge nuclear reactors Homer Simpson worked in. We're talking about smaller, less environmental impactful machines. I think this will be something that the legislature will talk about. And you also have to think about internally, DPPs, the new Thai faction is now in power. They have been the faction within the DPP being most pragmatic. They have been a faction that might not be as religious on nuclear issues. And given the dynamic that Wenchi just talked about, that we have TPP with A legislators. So don't be surprised that when the DPP and the KMT both without a majority in the legislature and big parties join hand on issues like this. If Lai Ching-te cannot deliver its economic promises or show the Taiwanese people when he said continuity from Tsai Ing-wen, he cannot deliver for people to have a better life. I think he will be in trouble very quickly.
Yeah, looks like we're going to have some interesting politics to watch. Wenchi Yu, on the TPP, I really didn't notice, it's my error, but have they had much of a policy around this energy issue?
I actually haven't paid that much attention to it. I don't know, Eric, have you?
It's just unfair to them since they don't have a representative here, but it's often the case that we don't know what their policies are.
Exactly. I mean, that's my point,
Yeah.
because their policies never, it's just not clear.
A strong leadership is obviously something people look for in politics. I think if we'll have to guess, knowing their other policy platforms, I assume they will, they probably lie within the KMT side. They are more pragmatic. They're willing to talk about this issue, discuss like a policy, not a religion. And I think both the KMT and TPP probably favor a more cost-efficient solution to this, other than just straight out say, okay, we're going to go all the way in despite its economic impacts.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it raises a problem given what Wenchi Yu was talking about earlier with the lack of a real organizational base and being very leader focused to really get a grip on what the policy is. Let me, this was something that came up a lot in reporting about the election. And let me ask to the two of you, and maybe start with Wenchi Yu and then go to Eric. And that is the question about outside interference in the election. We saw a lot about that. We saw things about AI. Some people have even said that perhaps trying to understand how Taiwan did or didn't neutralize those outside interferences might be helpful for the US election. Let's start with you, Wenchi Yu. Your thoughts on that?
I have to admit, I didn't really dig deeper into this. I definitely have read that it's happening, or it happened. And there's a lot of misinformation that came through. And certainly on sort of social media, you see a lot of sort of forwarded messages, etc. There's even, so for example, there's a scandal during the last week of the election that Lai Ching-te, had an affair, in even potentially a love child, etc. And so, of course, you never know where the source of the information came from. But, it is the misinformation, thing was real during the election.
Eric?
So misinformation has quite a history in Taiwan's election, but now we're talking about specifically Chinese interference, of course. And for that, I'll have two comments. One is that, from my perspective, thank God that when the Chinese do it, they often do it in an official capacity, meaning their message often relates to what the party central CCP wants to say, and doesn't really click with Taiwanese people. So Taiwanese people can quite often recognize a message being AI generated or is CCP generated, right? That being said, there are people in Taiwan who support the CCP, so democracy, even though very small percentage. So these people will disseminate those messages. But I don't think, my second comment is, I don't think it has been a big impact in Taiwan. I don't think it has swayed a lot of minds. If anything, I personally find it quite entertaining to watch those messages and how they are generated, just how these messages are just totally don't relate to how Taiwanese people think. And they are probably just there to kind of reinforce how CCP doesn't understand Taiwan's democracy or democracy at all.
Yeah, understanding democracy at all, I think, is a pretty good description. I think we got another question, which I think really you answered for us, Wenchi, and that was about the failure of the collaboration between KMT and TPP. Not surprisingly, we have a question really about going back to what we haven't talked so much about, is that Xi Jinping's possible responses, and those from Beijing, that they may see CCP is tired of what they might see as an incompetent KMT that's unable to win elections. Question is, given this, to what extent do you think the risk of conflict has risen due to a Lai win? How is each party practically planning to prevent a war with China without, this I think is the interesting part, agreeing to the one country, two systems formula? Wenchi, you about to start? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Of course, that was sort of the most talked about topic, probably, in the international media. Actually, less so, I think, in Taiwan. Again, because I think, the possibility of an actual conflict involving military is perceived as less likely by Taiwanese people. However, in what other forms of this kind of confrontation might happen? So, for example, there's a lot of, sort of the misinformation, informational kind of, I would say, war battle. And, in addition to that, there is a lot of anticipation, I would say, that China will continue, if not almost strengthen, increase its coercion measures. So these coercion measures, they have lots of tools they can deploy, from economic front, whether it's the trade service agreement, or whether to renew the cross-strait trade agreement, to diplomatically, we saw that Daewoo, which was a diplomatic ally to Taiwan, announced to discontinue that just a few days after the election, almost like a slap in Taiwan's face. And so while the actual number of Taiwan's diplomatic sort of allies doesn't matter as much for generally Taiwanese people, but right now there's only 13. And so when it comes to less than 10, right? Like, to what extent does the ruling government have to answer to the people, right? When you're saying you're increasing Taiwan's visibility and international participation, however, the recognition is dwindling down. So, there are just many tools that Beijing could potentially use, in addition to just military, which, obviously got most attention. But, I think a lot of people suspect that they may use other types of coercion before going into a real conflict, military conflict.
Yeah, I agree with that. That I think Taiwan has a lot, the mainland rather, has a lot of other tools at its disposal that it's liable to use to tighten before moving that area. We also have a question about what role did the chip industry play in the election, specifically leaders such as Maurice Chang and Robert Cao. Eric, is that something you paid any attention to?
So Robert Cao is Cao
Cao
Xingchen.
Xingchen,
No,
yeah.
yeah.
So Robert has been an influencer in Taiwan nowadays. He's very vocal,
Yeah.
Anti-CCP these days. Economy is a big thing. Economic policies are often viewed under the light of U.S.-Taiwan or cross-strait relations. So it's a big factor in Taiwan. People might not think about TSMC per se, but people look at it in a brighter aspect of the two bilateral relationships and how does that play into Taiwan's economy, right? So in the past three years, TSMC has been coined as Taiwan's silicon shield that has helped Taiwan to fight against the Chinese aggression, right? That being said, I think the Chinese will continue their three-pronged approach towards Taiwan, using economy as a tool to coerce Taiwan, using military aggression to scare Taiwan, and to take away to poach Taiwan's diplomatic allies and limit Taiwan's international space. I don't think any of these will work. That's why if I may tie back to the last question, Xi Jinping wanting reunification and one country, two system, that's why I think a valid argument can be made that he has to come to recognition. During his lifetime, I assume he will die in the next 40 years, if not sooner. It's hard for Taiwan's generation, say 20 years from now, my generation will be the leaders, I'm 40. The next generation will want to have a peaceful unification. If their plan is to use force to reunify Taiwan, this is when we have to be very careful to look at U.S.-Taiwan relations, because we have a lot of high-profile congressional visits to Taiwan, and using Speaker Pelosi's visit, for example, the Chinese use that as an excuse to pressure up its military aggression against Taiwan. We have heard rumors without any evidence that U.S. presidential candidate might travel to Taiwan. Those are the incidents that might throw Taiwan off its rail. And these are the incidents that the Chinese are looking for as excuses to do their behavior. And I think they have made up their mind already.
Yeah, I said on a number of occasions that, the visit of Speaker Pelosi was actually a wonderful gift for the People's Liberation Army. I mean, it gave them an opportunity to do much more expansive military exercises than they would have got away with absent that, it seems to me. Sorry, Wenchi, were you about to comment as well?
Yeah, I wanted to comment specifically on semiconductor issues, since that's also something that, gets a lot of international attention. Interesting. I didn't feel like that featured in, the domestic election conversations, generally speaking. However, I would say when TSMC announced their plans to invest in Arizona, and so there was a lot of, how many Taiwanese engineers are going to move to Arizona, and what is sort of the hollowing out effect for Taiwan semiconductor industry. That was hotly debated inside Taiwan. And so, and especially it was interesting. I don't know if there's direct correlation. From what I heard was that Ko-and-jo, for example, the TPP party, is extremely popular in the Hsinchu Science Park area, partially because he's from Hsinchu, but also, TPP has garnered a ton of support from what they would call the tech community people, right? So some may have felt sort of that, they didn't like the DPP's policy in general. When it comes to semiconductors, I heard a lot of grumbling about TSMC, investing in Arizona, etc. So I think, that sentiment may not have been widely covered internationally, but it is something that, I would say I've heard a lot of Taiwanese people questioning whether that is the right decision for TSMC, and how much was sort of, indirectly or directly coerced by the US.
Great. Given that we've got a legislature which is very finely balanced, what do you think the consequences of this will be for a new cabinet? Are we going to see a mix of cabinet ministers from different parties, or how do you think this might play out, either of you?
Wouldn't you like to go first?
I mean, he has pledged, President Lai, actually, in his victory speech, that his cabinet will, be inclusive. So I would assume that sends a signal that he intends to have people who are not necessarily from the DPP party. And that is not unprecedented. We've seen that in the past as well. That may be a way to, since they know they don't have the majority in the LY, in many ways, they really have to compromise.
But are they more likely to pick people from TPP, or do you think KMT folk will join Eric?
Well, Eric will probably know better.
That's what I'm asking Eric.
My suspicion is, yes, he will try to have non-DPP members, and with the people that politically align with the DPP. So scholars, most likely. In terms of, to answer Tony's question directly, would there be any TPP or KMT cabinet ministers? I think the answer is unlikely. KMT, at least the part, so if individuals willing to join the government is one thing. I don't think at this time KMT will be willing to send our people to join William Lai's administration. TPP, even more unlikely. They are a very small party. I can't think of anybody who is eligible. The second, I think politically, if TPP decide to side with the DPP, I think that will be a Christmas gift to the KMT. And I think they are unwilling to make that alignment yet. So the short answer is yes, Lai Ching-te will try to invite as many scholars that leans DPP as possible. But will there be any KMT or TPP members in his cabinet? I think the answer is probably close to zero.
Great. Well, we're almost at the bewitching hour. So just a quick answer to a last question. If you were there listening to William Lai on May 20th as he takes over, what is the one thing you would like to hear him highlight? Let's start with Wenchi. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I actually would like to hear him talking about not just one thing, two things. One, on cross-strait relations, I want to hear him say something different. He's been saying pretty much the same lines as President Tsai Ing-wen. And, while he may be following her lines, but, they're two different people at the end of the day. And so, he has to show that he is his own leader. So I look forward to hearing something new, if at all possible. Second is really about, obviously, domestic issues, economic issues, how he's going to really help the young generation feel there's some hope. I think for the last many years, really the younger generation just feels very hopeless. And this gives the reason why the TPP was able to rise so fast. But there doesn't seem to be any real solutions so far, even the TPP. So it was more of a just, an outlet for the young people rather than some concrete policy solutions.
Yeah, certainly housing, wages, employment have been key issues for younger people. Eric, how about you? What would you like to hear?
So I was quite excited when education reform was one of the discussion topic in this election, which hasn't been the case for a long time. So I want to hear how does William Lai, the President Lai, intend to uplift Taiwanese youth. In the US, we talk about STEM education. I would like for him to hear the same thing, to share his vision. I don't think cross-strait relations or US-Taiwan relation will have major changes. I don't think anything he say or do can convince the CCP to work with him. So I want him to do what matters, that is to educate our Taiwanese people so our people can shine internationally and potentially to build the next chip industry and make impact that way.
Great. I'm sorry and I apologize to those whose questions I didn't get to, but I think really should thank Wenchi and Eric for a really enlightening conversation. So thank you very, very much for today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.